experimental research. As I hope you remember, non-experimental research is exactly that. It's the kind of research that is defined by the fact that the researcher does not manipulate any variables. The researcher does not manipulate any variables. And because of that, it often has high external validity and is often done in real life settings. So, as you remember, if something has high external validity, it really relates to the real world. And as I also hope you remember, there are some problems with this type of research because we're not sure what causes what. We don't know the directionality if there's a relationship between two variables. We don't know if A causes B or B causes A, or if there is a third variable that possibly might cause both of them. So with that in mind, let's talk some more about non-experimental research. This is the kind of lecture that I just like to call a laundry list lecture. I'm giving you 5 different kinds of non-experimental research methods, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one. I'm going to describe it and give you an example of each type. I'll talk about naturalistic observations, ethnographies, case histories, content analysis, and meta-analysis. So let's start. Naturalistic observations. I'll have that down 3 times. Naturalistic observations. These are observing participants in their natural environment. So naturalistic observations are observing participants in their natural environment, and we don't manipulate any variables, which of course, because it's non-experimental research. Now, the most important part of naturalistic observations are that they are unobtrusive. And what we mean by that is that the participants or the phenomena of observation is not aware that it is being observed. And that's because of the Heisenberg principle, which basically says that something changes if it knows that it's being watched. That is what observed changes. So we want to make sure that these people don't know they're being watched, because we don't want their behavior to change. We want to know what they really act like when nobody else is around. The pros of this type of research is it's got really high external validity. We're watching people when they don't know that we're watching them, so they're behaving like they normally would. What we want to see, high external validity to the real world. The cons are that we cannot determine causality. We don't know which variable causes which, or if they might be caused by a third variable. So my example of naturalistic observations is one that I really like to talk about. It is one that I did personally, and it's really the one that made me decide that I wanted to go into some sort of research, psychology and human development. And I did it for one of my professors, who was Robert Levine. He ended up being the first author of this article, of the article I'm going to talk about. And he basically studied the pace of life. And it's a fascinating construct. And he started studying it because he was an exchange professor, I guess. Not an exchange student, but an exchange professor to Brazil. And his first lecture, he was so excited to come and give, and they said it would be at 7. So he showed up at the school at 7, ready to meet some students, ready to talk about a lecture. Well, nobody showed up. The first person showed up like around 8:30, and they all came in around 9. And this was in the evening, of course. And he's like, what is up with this? Why were you guys all late? And they had a great session. And he finally asked them, and they said, oh, we're on Brazilian time. If somebody says to be there at 7, that means you start thinking about getting ready at 7. Then you come when you feel like. That's how we do time here. And he started thinking, yeah, that's really interesting. People do in different environments perceive time differently. And so that's what he studied for the rest of his career. He studied the perception of time. And he actually wrote a really fascinating book on it if you're interested. He and he was onto something, I think. And I think any of you who either live on a neighbor island or on the North Shore or somewhere really out of town, out of any towns on Oahu, know that time seems to run differently. I know the minute I step into that inner island terminal at the Honolulu airport, I just feel a little more relaxed. I'm not as stressed out about time. So what I did for Dr. Levine, I was one of his research assistants. And I was going to 2 countries that he didn't have measures of. You see that his pace of life was in 31 countries. And I went to Prague and Budapest. So in Prague and Budapest, a friend and I were backpacking around, and we measured a couple of things for Dr. Levine in naturalistic observations. The first thing we did was the accuracy of clocks. So he had a pretty strict research protocol, and I carried a little index card in my backpack with the materials for all of this research and instructions. So for the accuracy of clocks, all we had to do was look on a map and find downtown. And most of the time in these old European cities, that's where you are anyway, because that's where all the tourist attractions and stuff are. So look at find downtown, look at a clock, hopefully a big clock that's in the center of a square or maybe at the top of a bank or church, and set your watch to 1 o'clock, and then go and find 3 or 4 other clocks and see how accurate they are. See how close the clocks are to each other. See, and that tells you if the people are concerned with the accuracy of clocks. Now, some countries that he or his assistants went to, the clocks were completely accurate. Like Switzerland, they were down to the second. Every clock was exactly synchronized. There's some places in Africa where they didn't even have clocks. And in my cities, Prague and Budapest, there were some clocks, but they were a little bit off. Which that was his construct, was accuracy, was understanding of time, and his measure was the accuracy of clocks. And being a little bit off was a measure that time is important to them, but not absolutely critical like it is to the Swiss or some other countries. Okay, the second one we did was walking speed. And remember that the goal of naturalistic observations is to remain unobtrusive. So what we did for this is in our backpacks, we carried a piece of string that was exactly 100 yards long. So the morning that we did this experiment, I guess it wasn't really an experiment, it was an observation. We walked around town and we found a good place that had a cafe like on one side of the street and then a long interrupted sidewalk on the other side of the street. So we first started, after we had identified the place, we started at the long interrupted sidewalk, and we took our string and we measured a starting point and an ending point of exactly 100 yards. Okay, so we had, I'm sorry, it wasn't 100 yards, it was about 100 feet, because 100 yards was way too long. 100 feet, we measured start and stop points, and then we went and did something else for a couple hours, because we didn't want because people noticed us making those markings, and we didn't want anybody to act differently than they normally would. So we wanted to make sure that there were different people at the cafe, and people had pretty much forgotten about these weird foreigners making marks, not really marks, but, taking string on their sidewalk. So after we had our start and end points, and we realized that we were unobtrusive, we went and ordered a cup of coffee at that cafe across the street. And we each had a watch with a second hand on it, and we counted the number of seconds, tallied the number of seconds that it took people to walk from point A to point B. The couple of the seconds that it took people to walk 100 feet. We wrote that down. We did 50 males and 50 females, and we averaged those for the walking speed. And we tried to, if you'll remember sampling, we tried to just take the first pair of feet that happened at the starting point, the next, after we had finished one person. So we didn't try to pick slow people or fast people. We tried to pick them as randomly as we possibly could. So that's walking speed. And also another interesting way to measure time. You know, cities, Honolulu, one of my students said it just stresses her out because she lived on the North Shore and everybody was so fast. They walk fast, they talk fast, where at her house, everybody's just a little slower. You get time to relax, you walk slow, and you get time to think and appreciate these surroundings. So walking speed would be another indication of the pace of life, a fast pace of life. And then the third one was post office speed. And this was one that we prepared ahead of time. We did a little research and we found, the average or the type of stamp that someone would buy to send a letter. Not a postcard, not, big old package, just a garden variety letter stamp. And then we had the next biggest amount of change, or the next biggest amount of money to pay for it. So for example, I don't know how much stamps are now. They're like 70 or 80 cents, I think. So what we would do is we would walk into a post office, ask and give them a card in their language that we had pre-prepared with that said, "I would like one stamp, please," and then hand them the closest dollar bill. And we would the other person would time how long it took them to do the transaction. Did they stop? Did they talk? Did they go really quickly? And that was another measure of the pace of life. Because in some countries, let's say you are in New York City downtown, they're going to make that post office as quickly as possible. I mean, they're just going to get him and get him out. Where if you're in a place where, like, let's say Hilo, the post worker is going to stop, ask you how you're doing, ask how you like town, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one place another way that we measure the pace of life. So I really loved this study, first of all, because it's a great example of naturalistic observations. We tried to be as normal as possible. And it also is another great idea or example of measurement. We've got 3 different ways, all are continuous, on a continuous scale, that we measured how quickly people move in their daily lives, what the pace of life is. And what Dr. Levine did that's super interesting is he actually correlated the pace of life with health metrics and health measures from the countries here. And he found that high pace of life was associated with higher incidences of cardiovascular disease, smoking, because that's an example of how someone copes with stressful behavior, stressful pace of life. So really, really interesting construct and good example of naturalistic observations as well as measurement. So that's naturalistic observations. The second type of non-experimental research is ethnography. And ethnographies are where the researcher becomes a part of the social system being studied. It is characterized by participant observation, where the most important thing is gaining access and remaining invisible. And then careful observation. So it's not just like hanging out and saying what you think happened. Participant observation, people keep really good notes. I have here an example. You might wonder about the picture of Drew Barrymore. And if you've ever seen the movie Never Been Kissed, a really, really cute movie. And in that movie, she's a reporter who wants to get a story of what it's like in high school. And so she pretends like she's a high school student. and becomes a high school student. So she gains access. People really think she is a high school student. Now, ethnographies also include non-participant observation. And a great example of that is a study by, I've forgotten their names, but it's in the adolescent literature. And the husband and wife, married sociologists, decided they wanted to study their children's teenage social hierarchies, which if you've been a teenager, you know they're kind of rough, right? So these researchers wanted to know about teenage social hierarchies, and they took very careful notes. I think they may have even recorded conversations and interactions that were going on when they drove their kids to soccer practice, back and forth. So as you may guess, as we know from the adolescents, they identified kind of a leader in every group and several followers, some other really interesting things. But the main point is that ethnographies are where the researcher actually becomes a part of the social system being studied, either being a participant observation or non-participant. And in both of these, it's really a key to remain unobtrusive, remain invisible. And the data analysis on this is mostly qualitative because it's really hard to measure things, especially when you're driving a car and the people behind you or you're part of a social system. You can't stop and ask people to say something again or measure. So what you do is you take very good notes on the quality of things, what you think the conversations were, people's reactions. So the data analysis is mostly qualitative on these types of research. Another example is, I think was particularly fascinating now, is ethnographies have kind of gotten a renaissance now that there's so much activity on the internet. One really interesting ethnographies include when people become part of a virtual social system. So this picture is of people playing a game, a virtual reality game, and researchers have become embedded into these communities, like what's that, Minecraft, and there's that other one. I can't remember. You guys know them better than I do, but those games that people play, and they understand a lot about social dynamics, or at least online social dynamics. Or lately, there have been people, what a lot of us who are not involved in the QAnon conspiracy, what we do know is from people who've been online and pretended to be part of that conspiracy. And so somebody who did that, taking notes formally with a lot of training, would be doing an ethnographic study. Okay, the last one before I go to my appointment that you can see right there on top. The last type of study I'm going to talk about is a case history before we take our break. So case histories are in-depth study of a single case. And the authors of your textbook will actually say that these are not non-experimental research because they're only a study of one person. But I've included them because I think they're really important. They can give us so many good ideas about what can go on in certain circumstances, and they give us a lot of ideas, and then we can follow up on ideas with different types of non-experimental research or even experimental research. And one of the most famous case histories, I think all the HDFS majors and most of the ones who are not HDFS majors might remember Jean Piaget. And he was a French psychologist, actually a developmental psychologist, who formulated his theory on young children's learning and thinking by watching his daughters grow up. So he started with a case history, and every day he talked to his daughter. He'd kind of figure out how she was seeing the world and what she was thinking. And from that, he put forth a theory of cognitive development that researchers then followed up with a lot more people. But that case study was really important to get things going on that theory. So it's not an experimental design. So the researcher's not manipulating any variables at all. So he wasn't manipulating the age of his daughter, or he wasn't, giving her tasks to see what caused what. He was just observing, and observing very well, taking very good notes, good objective notes. It's often used in clinical studies. I used to use an example of a woman having a panic attack, because there's some really good case studies on what a panic attack feels like and what types of things help people who are experiencing those types of things. So it's common. In that case, it was used in a clinical study, and the researchers still use systematic observation. Like all of these non-experimental studies, just because it's not done in a lab and just because people aren't taking questionnaires or using formal equipment, doesn't mean that we aren't objective and scientific in how we take our notes or record that behavior. So it still uses systematic observation. And as I said before, it may generate other questions for other studies. For examples are patient studies, that was like that panic attack, or developmental studies. And right now, I'd like you to sit back where I give you one of the most famous case studies in all of psychology, one of my favorites. And when I teach this class in the fall, it falls on Halloween, which is always a lot of fun. And that's the case of Phineas Gage. Some of you may have heard it, but I'll tell it to you again because it's great, really interesting. So Phineas Gage was a respected and well-spoken young man who worked for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. This was in New England. The tools of his trade consisted of picks, shovels, drills, and explosives. One of his tools was a tamping rod, which measured 42 inches and weighed 13 pounds and 4 ounces. So think about that. That's like over 2.5 big bags of flour. So this was a really heavy piece of steel. It was used to tamp the dynamite tightly into the rock crevices. I think it might be similar. I think Hawaiians call it an o'o, just a big stick. But this was iron and really, really heavy. So Gage was working on a section of rail in Cavendish, Vermont. On September 13th, he was setting a charge. Because of what occurred, his story is one of the most interesting ones related to psychology. Several versions of what occurred differ somewhat, but basically he was setting a charge and tamping the explosive down into the rock when there was an explosion. In a matter of seconds, the iron rod was sent through the air like a missile. Whew. The iron rod went right through his face, just below his left cheek. You can see that skeleton there. It's reversed, so you'll see it on the right, and through the top of his head. The rod landed 30 yards away, covered in his blood. When the men and his crew came running, to their astonishment, he was slumped over, but still alive. They helped him to his feet and walked him to a cart and rode him 3/4 of a mile into town to see Dr. John Harlow. The doctor could not be found, so Dr. Williams in a nearby town was summoned. When he arrived, Gage said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." So he'd just been hit by a rod, and he said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." The doctor recorded that the rod left an inverted funnel opening that was 2 inches in diameter. The 13-pound rod had entered his head just below. Okay, wait, I said that already. Later, Dr. Harlow came and was astonished that Gage was still alive and coherent. In fact, he directed his questions directly to Gage rather than his crew. He immediately began to work on the injury. He removed all of the small bone chips while placing the larger ones back into place. Then he closed the wound and waited. It was reported that Gage, despite being bandaged, was seen walking around town acting strange and saying rather peculiar things. He was not the man he was before. He was not the dependable man he was before. He became foul-mouthed and said whatever came to mind. He often said things that hurt and disappointed others. Later, Harlow wrote, "The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and his animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. His friends left him, he lost his job, and he lost his motivation to live. Later, he worked for a short time in P.T. Barnum's Freak Museum in New York. And sadly, Gage died 13 years later while having an epileptic seizure." In 1867, Dr. Harlow contacted Gage's sister and asked if she would donate Gage's skull and the tamping rod to the Warren Medical Museum at Harvard University. Phineas Gage's accident demonstrated the role of the brain on emotion and behavior. In 1992, Hannah and Antonio Damasio, the really famous neuroscientist, studied Gage's skull using sophisticated equipment. They discovered that the rod had not destroyed the frontal lobe area for speech and motor behavior. So that's why he could still talk. He still had his frontal lobe. Thus, Phineas was able to talk and move about at ease. The rod had destroyed part of the underside of the frontal lobe, causing a change in his personality. People who have had this area damaged find it difficult to censor their thoughts before saying what they think. Consequently, he would say things that hurt and disgusted others. So the really interesting thing about this case is it's just one case, but it predicted what we would learn with modern neuroscientific methods 150 plus years later. So this is a really famous case study that opened up some of what we know about the brain, what we know now about the frontal lobe. It was a great, opened up a lot of things for further study just by an accident. So I'm going to leave you now, and I will come back in a couple minutes and finish the lecture.